Welcome to the Smithers Insight Podcast, the place for trends, tech and insights driving the global markets. From sustainable solutions to smart innovations, we unpack it all.
Hello and welcome to the next instalment of the Smithers Insight Podcast. Today I'm joined by Rob Outram, our in-house packaging specialist. Hi Rob, how are you doing?
Yes, very well, thank you.
I wonder before we start if you could just give me a bit of an overview as to your background and how you ended up with Smithers.
Yeah, so I'm quite new to Smithers, been with Smithers 6 months, but I spent 30 years consulting in the chemicals, materials, packaging space for various sort of consulting companies. And I've worked everything from the monomer side, the plastic sides, the pulp and paper sides, to even working with major sort of brands like Unilever, Nestle over the years, Tetra Pak, Amcor, around packaging.
Excellent. So you're very well placed to talk about regulations today then?
Absolutely. It's a very hot topic, yes.
Yeah. So I suppose to kick us off, can you give us an overview as to the main regulations the packaging industry should be aware of today?
Yeah, so there's two major ones, particularly in Europe. So we have the PPWR, so that's the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulations. And the whole ethos of this PPWR regulation is to reduce the amount of packaging going to landfill. So that's first way of doing that is to simply reduce the amount of packaging on the market. So there's various sort of parameters in there that encourage the packaging and the companies and the brands to reduce the amount of packaging they're putting on the market, but also the packaging that they put on the market needs to be more sustainable. So it's all about promoting recycling. There's also an element of the PPWR that encourages good practices like deposit return schemes. Again, it's about reducing the amount of packaging going to landfill. So that's the first one. Now there's a second one called Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR. And that's basically a mechanism where the cost of the recycling and the management of the end of life of packaging gets pushed back to the brands as opposed to the municipalities and the councils having to pay to basically manage that waste stream. And each EU member state or North American state, Canada for instance, has its own format of doing it, so it becomes quite tricky. But again, much like the PPWR, it's all about encouraging reduction of the amount of packaging. It gives rewards for good practices that fit with the existing infrastructure, and also penalises bad practices or bad materials that those particular member states don't like. So there's two there, PPWR and EPR.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the brands a couple of times and sort of the impact that these regulations will have on them. If you're sort of further down or further towards the beginning of the value chain, how can packaging converters prepare for the impact of regulations?
Yeah, so the converters have a tough job on their hands. I think the first thing I would do is limit your exposure to sort of bad packaging formats. And, you know, when you start reading through these regulations, it's very clear that materials like polystyrene, XPS, EPS aren't generally liked by the recyclers. It's quite difficult to recycle them, or there's no existing infrastructure in place to do that. Again, laminates I would put in a similar kind of position. So very, very difficult when you've got paper with a plastic sheet, bonded, glued to it, to recycle laminates. So if a converter's into laminates, I would be wary about that. And also flexible plastics as well from the PPWR regulation. You have to be able to demonstrate that you can recycle these materials at scale, and that's the key point, at scale. So limiting your exposure to these sort of bad formats is one way, is one thing I think you need to prepare for. The other thing is to understand where the raw materials are coming from. So the brands, their customers, the converters' customers, are going to be asking all kinds of information about the raw materials, the type of packaging, what's in the packaging, what additives are in there, what coatings are in there. So they need to be geared up to answer the questions about the sort of chain of custody, and also the ingredients that are going into the packaging, because that's going to be asked by their customers.
So a move more towards monomaterials with a transparency if there isn't a monomaterial option.
Yeah, absolutely. So the mono-material, that's really the holy grail. If you're not having to separate dissimilar materials, you can recycle a mono-material much, much easier. The detection machines at the sorting place can separate them. So there's a big push. I mentioned the EPR. You can often get bonuses around eco-modulation bonuses around having mono-materials and things like that.
And then coming back to the brand owners, we've sort of mentioned already that EPR affects them the most, and they're going to be interrogating their converters and their supply chains. How else can they prepare for regulations that are coming in?
So one is to, first of all, just be on top of understanding what's coming down the pipeline. And, at Smithers, we do a number of projects now. First of all, helping customers with the existing EPR, but also understanding what's going to be coming through, so how it's going to evolve. So, if you were a big brand, a Unilever, a Nestle, or a Bayer, you need to be planning years in advance in terms of your packaging strategy. So you need to understand what's coming down the pipeline. So understanding that's the main thing. The other thing is understanding absolutely everything about the packaging that you're dealing with. So it's not just the weight, that's the obvious one, because you need to start reporting on the weights for the EPRs and paying the relevant fees. But understanding the type of material, even to the degree of what additives are in there. For instance, you get penalised by EPR if you've got carbon black in some EU member states. So understanding what pigments, what additives are in there, and also the coatings. So as we're seeing the shift towards paperization, obviously paper is very absorbent. You need to put a coating on it to make it water or grease proof, and understanding what coating is on there. Is it an EVOH coating, and how thick is that coating, and what percentage weight? So we can go into the weeds on this, but you really need to understand everything about the packaging. One, so that you can do the reporting, but also to avoid the penalties and also get the bonuses as well. And then the final thing I would say from a brand point of view, we're talking about PPWR and EPR, but I think you need to look more holistically about the packaging as well. So, we need to be looking at carbon footprint and some of these other environmental aspects, because it might be great to move to paper, but if it means deforesting half of Canada to do it, then that's not a good practice. So brands need to be taking a holistic view of the packaging and what's going on there.
And then you spoke about packaging strategies and having to adapt to the changing landscape. Which materials are most likely to be affected by the incoming regulations, and how might those landscapes look over the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, so again, I think the formats that the recyclers prefer are going to be pushed with respect to regulations and also EPR. So I mentioned the EPS, the XPS, the flexible plastics, the laminates. They're the ones that I would kind of avoid. From that point of view. And another thing, just on the previous question that I mentioned, it's also, and it's related to this question, is finding the right PROs. So there's organisations called producer responsibility organisations. They run the recycling schemes, and they will have their own preferences for the type of material. And they also have different fees as well. So when the brands are gearing up to deal with all this regulations, they really need to be understanding, which PROs are in their territory and what are the fees each one's charging, because you might be able to get a cost reduction in your fees by changing PROs or working with the PROs, and the PROs will also be able to advise what direction they're going in with respect to the recycling infrastructure that they're putting in place.
And then we hear quite a lot about paperisation of the packaging industry at the moment. What role does regulation play in that movement? Is it something that we're going to see more of, or is it going to start scaling back and be more material based or in use case?
Yeah, I think a lot of these regulations are obviously as a result of sort of customer or public desire. So obviously the public, and again we've done surveys at Smithers as to what the public like from packaging, and paper is obviously seen as a very sort of green, sustainable source. It will biodegrade, it will break down if you don't cover it in plastic. The recycling at scale is the key one. So there's lots of different packaging formats. They all have their merits, they all have their downsides, but the key thing is the packaging being able to be recyclable at scale. Also, EPR is favourable for the paper formats. Mm-hmm. Paper's quite easy to recycle. There's a good existing infrastructure around paper-based formats. So we are seeing a shift from plastic towards paper. And as I said, we did a recent survey where people are expecting, paper to make inroads into, the market share of paper-based products, moulded fibre and things like that being taking over from some of the other formats. Plastic is a fantastic material, though. We're not going to see eradication of plastic, but as you rightly say, moving towards mono material plastic, mm-hmm. that's quite an easy recyclable area. One final point to mention around sort of paperization, we've seen a real portion advancement in things like barrier coatings that have really helped paper get into more complex areas of use. So again, that's really pushed the industry on. But as I mentioned previously, we need to be quite careful about how much coating we're putting on the paper, what type of coating we're putting on the paper, because it may have repercussions in terms of EPR fees going forwards. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then I think there's no silver bullet to solve the problem that we find ourselves in with waste in the packaging industry. But what's the one thing that the industry can take away or be more aware of or change to be in line with as regulations become much more important?
Yeah, there's no silver bullet, and again, it's application specific. As I said, plastic's a fantastic material for some applications that paper can't do. Paper, moulded fibre, etc. is a fantastic material that's equally applicable in other applications. So there is no silver bullet, as you rightly say. You need to pick and choose your material as and when. I think that the main thing to do is to collect data, as I mentioned, not just from a reporting point of view, but from a holistic point of view, and really understand what the content of the packaging is, what it's made out of, where it comes from, that chain of custody, the weight, the type, the source, the additives, everything that goes into it. That will be the key thing, to really understand where it's come from and what are the environmental implications. So it doesn't matter really whether it's plastic or whether it's moulded fibre. It's having that complete visibility of the impact on the environment.
Great. And I suppose finally, is there a role that deregulation plays in this world? Is PPWR too far? Is it something that the industry needs to look at and assess a little bit more? What's your opinion around that?
Yeah, so my opinion of the PPWR, it's been a long time in the making. This hasn't just suddenly leapt up on us. This is now a directive, a regulation rather than a directive. So we previously had the directive. The regulation is now legally enforceable. But it's been a long time in the pipeline. People have had time to gear up and deal with PPWR. That's not to say it hasn't been a challenge, and there are, we're helping clients with numerous grey areas within the PPWR, launching new products onto the market and understanding, does their packaging fit with the PPWR. I don't think it's gone too far. I think where there's sort of trouble, if you like, is more on the EPR side of things. So, like with most sort of European legislation, the European Commission leave it to the individual member states to implement that legislation themselves. And with the EPR, they all seem to have their own way of doing things, and that causes a problem. If you're a big brand and you're selling chocolate bars in France, Germany, Spain, etc., etc. You know, you need to come up with a strategy that you know, you can't. It's very difficult to have one type of packaging in France, another type of packaging in Germany, another type of packaging in Italy. So putting together a sort of regional wide strategy is very, very difficult, and that's where the problem lies. So I don't think we need to rewind or backtrack on the legislation, but I think if there was some kind of harmonisation, and that's the key word here, harmonisation with the EPR in particular, that would be really useful, and also tightening up on some of these grey areas in the PPWR legislation. I mean, just to give one example, you know, there's no guidelines in the PPWR about residuals. So if you have a shampoo bottle, there's no guidelines as you know, 1% residual content, 2%, 5%, you know, what is acceptable in terms of residual contents, and that's just one area where there doesn't seem to be any sort of clear guidance. So I think we need to tighten it up, give a bit more clarity within some of these regulations, and the EPR bit is there could be some harmonisation. But that said, you know, there's a lot of commonality with the EPR. We can see in most of the member states, you know, the move away from, you know, problematic materials and the shift towards monomeric mono materials is the way forward.
That's great. Thank you ever so much for your time, Rob. If anybody has any questions on regulations or understanding how their business can be more prepared for the incoming regulations, do feel free to reach out. Smithers can help in a multitude of ways. Thank you ever so much again.
Pleasure.
You've been listening to the Smithers Insight podcast. Subscribe, share and join us next time to unpack more industry developments.